Dr. James Heaps was a gynecologist. He sexually abused hundreds of patients at UCLA. By opting out of the class action settlement, that allows survivors the option of filing an individual case.
And if UCLA didn't know about it, that's one thing. But they did. They did nothing.
How many women do you think he did that to?
USA Gymnastics has filed for bankruptcy protection.
Larry Nassar stands accused as one of the most prolific child molesters in sporting history.
You know, when people think of perpetrators, they often think of somebody who's obvious, who is a drooling ghoul, if you will. The drooling ghoul is almost never the perpetrator. Perpetrators who are effective, meaning that have a lot of victims and get away for a long time, are smart. At some level, they're charming. They can be caring and likable. Larry Nassar was a nice guy. He was decent, kind, caring, but he was also a sexual predator. And I think the same can be true of Dr. Heaps.
I had an abnormal pap smear in 1998, and I was referred to Dr. Heaps. I was going just to check and see if everything was okay after the abnormal pap. I was planning on having a child within that year. I certainly wanted to make sure that I was safe, you know, that I could get pregnant without a problem. So I'm at UCLA, I'm in Westwood. You drive in, you get your parking ticket, find a spot. There was just this innocence of going in and, you know, and trusting and believing that I was going to be taken care of, and that I was being referred to someone who supposedly had a great reputation in the field. I'm going to be taken care of. He was charming, definitely charming, and charming scares me. He was flirting with me right away. I was uneasy. I remember being uneasy. You know, the doors closed and he told his nurse to leave, and like my life completely changed after that. I was in stirrups and in a paper gown, and like all of that is just such a vulnerable, you know, physically vulnerable state. He took his hands and he opened my legs, even though my legs were already open, but he pressed my legs open wider and then started to caress my legs. And it was not an exam. I know the difference. Like he was copying a feel. It was that kind of feeling. He did tremendous harm to my body, and it happened more than once.
If you're Heaps and you get away with it, right, and then you get away with it again, and you get away with it again, what happens in the cycle of perpetration is it gets bolder and bolder and bolder and bolder and worse and worse and worse.
So disturbing. It's so horrific. So, you know, just the physical harm that he did was awful, but the emotional, like how I had to put my clothes back on. I had to like check out and, you know, like I said, and go in an elevator with people and sort of have this experience of, I'm pretty sure I was just raped. I'm at the medical building. What just happened?
Very similar to George Tyndall and Nassar. he did this along the way. I mean, you're talking about 25 plus years of doing this.
Dr. James Heaps was a gynecologist and oncologist with the UCLA health system. He molested, sexually abused, and sexually harassed hundreds of patients throughout his time with the UCLA system. Tragically, many of Dr. Heaps' victims were cancer survivors, women who were still battling cancer, people who were literally fighting for their lives and didn't have any choice but to see Dr. Heaps. And Dr. Heaps really took advantage of that vulnerability. He knew that they didn't have any other option. He knew that they trusted him completely.
He did treat students, but what he really specialized in is gynecology and cancers related to women, breast, vaginal, ovarian, all the reproductive organs, and that's what he did. It's my understanding he was the highest or one of the highest paid physicians in the UC system. And over his time in practice, there were numerous complaints.
He was reported to the medical board as early as the late 90s. He was reported again in 2013, and the university system kept him on board. They allowed Dr. Heaps to continue seeing patients despite these multiple complaints, and tragically, his abuse was able to continue until December of 2017. At that time, Dr. Heaps was reported to UCLA again. There was finally an investigation conducted, and Dr. Heaps was found by the university system to have committed sexual misconduct. Even at that time, UCLA continued to cover up for Dr. Heaps, essentially allowing him to quietly resign without telling any of Dr. Heaps' patients that he'd been found responsible for committing sexual misconduct. It wasn't until June of 2019 when Dr. Heaps was criminally charged and arrested with sexually abusing 2 of his patients that this story finally came to light, and Dr. Heaps survivors finally realized that he wasn't providing them with legitimate medical treatment, but he was sexually abusing them. When you have someone like Dr. Heaps who is in such a position of trust in the community, you need to hold those people to a higher standard. They took a Hippocratic oath to do no harm, and they are very well compensated by the university system. They're very protected, and if you allow someone like that to hold that position of trust, the damage, as we've seen in this case, it's just devastating.
The medical board estimates, I believe, he had 6,000 patients total. I think there's around 300 that have come forward. In my experience, when you have 300 victims come forward, that probably means you have 3,000. What we know about sexual assault is most victims never come forward, so that what you see is a tiny fraction. With Nassar, for example, there were about 350 women in the case we settled, and then right after the settlement, 300 or 400 more came forward. You know, I think people are afraid they're not going to be believed.
Joining me now exclusively in her first nationally televised interview and the first brave survivor in all of this. Welcome. It is good to have you here today. You were a gymnast who was, working out and learning the sport when he took advantage of you. At what age?
8 years old through 25 years old. 17 years of abuse, 3 to 4 times a week, every year, for almost 2 decades.
I didn't reconcile that I had been sexually abused by a physician until I was 36 years old. Larry Nassar is now known as the most prolific serial pedophile in the history of sport. Larry, to me, started as my athletic trainer in small town of Lansing, Michigan, who then went on to become a 4-time Olympic team doctor. In 2018, he was sentenced to the rest of his life in prison for sexually abusing over 300 little girls. Now we know that number to be well over 500. Coming forward for me was a really difficult process because you spend decades trying to push down what your psyche and your body know to be your truth. It's hard, first and foremost, to admit to yourself that you're a victim of sexual abuse, and then to come forward and speak it aloud to a law firm or even a therapist or a friend makes it real. And it's extremely important that in that moment you are met with a person who understands. In Nassar, I got to see a lot of true colors. And when you go to war with people, so to speak, you get to see what they're made of. And so I went to war with mainly Stewart and Finaldi. They took on the Olympic movement, and they did it with such grace and such care for the survivors that I decided if I'm going to enter this field, I'm gonna go to war with the very best.
Mental health can often be more devastating than physical health. One of the things I think about often as a veteran is that you see men and women that come back from war and they look fine, but they open their mouths and they're still in Afghanistan or still in Vietnam, fighting, and they will be for the rest of their lives. And these women didn't sign up for that. They went to their doctor to get health care, and they shouldn't have to endure the emotional scars for the rest of their lives. The abuse of children is the enemy, and we are going to attack it. I had my first sexual abuse case in 1997. I had a business client whose son had been molested by a priest. In 2001, settled it for $5.2 million, which still is the largest individual settlement against a Catholic priest in the history of the world, let alone the US. My practice in that area just exploded. My phone didn't stop ringing and hasn't. And it's gone from, clergy to coaches in schools to doctors in sports, and now, sadly, UCLA. On the Larry Nassar case, we obtained a $500 million settlement against Michigan State University, and we were able to basically force Michigan State into a position where they had no choice but to settle and make right by our clients. I want to be really clear. Those numbers simply represent the harm done. With Larry Nassar, to have $1 billion, it gives our clients justice, but also sends a message to places like UCLA, USC, and other institutions who've had this problem: don't do it. And I'm really most proud of the fact that I think it's our clients' voices have made a difference, and we've been a vehicle for them to have that voice.
I have a lot of compassion for victims of sexual abuse, and they need a strong advocate to help them through the justice process. I would see a grown woman that had never told anyone. I didn't think anyone would believe them. I have a child who's going to testify and talk about things they don't even really understand that were done to them. So it's been a privilege and an honor to help victims navigate the system and know they have a fighter on their side and bring justice and get monsters off the streets. I went to USC Law School. I was there from '89 to '92. I went to see a doctor there, George Tyndall, and I was abused. I was ashamed, I was mad, and I was scared, and I didn't tell anyone. Part of the reasons I didn't tell is because USC is a huge institution. I mean, they have untold amounts of influence, power, resources. It's almost like a religion in Los Angeles or in California to go to USC and that network. And UCLA's not so different. I think there's a lot of similarities when you have a gynecologist who a woman should be able to completely trust, that it's backed and endorsed by a huge institution that's been around for a long time, that everyone loves and respects, and then to be completely betrayed and abused within that system is very disempowering. I came forward when I saw a news flash pop up on my phone that the USC president was stepping down under scandal, and I realized it was all about Dr. Tyndall. It had been almost 30 years since I had seen him. A younger woman had just come forward, and I just knew I needed to stand by them like I'd stood for other victims. It was time. It's time to tell my story. I was interviewing different law firms to figure out who's gonna help me through this process, and I was sitting in my parking lot going into work one day. John Manley called me on the phone. We had a conversation, and I knew right then and there that this was it. This was the guy who's gonna protect me. He was gonna stand for me. He understood me. and he wasn't afraid of USC.
Massive universities. These people have tremendous legal resources. And how is it that a small firm in California can do what we do? And I can tell you what the answer is. It's not because I'm a genius. It's because we have the truth. If somebody comes up to you on the street, sticks a gun in your rib and says, give me your money, that's awful, and they took it, but I didn't trust them, they're a robber, right? You don't expect that to happen when you go to your trusted doctor because you have cancer at UCLA. And if UCLA didn't know about it, that's one thing, but they did. They did nothing, and these women are suffering the consequences of it, and it's not okay. They deserve to be held accountable, and they should be held accountable. We believe in what we're doing, and we will not stop. Class action settlements were really developed a long time ago to deal with large situations where there was a wrong done, and that wrong is measurable across the same amount for everybody. So for example, if you go and you rent a car and they charge you a gasoline fee that you didn't agree to, and they were doing it across the board, and it would say it was $20 per person. 3 or 4 people can file a class action, and then the lawyers can recover $20 for the hundreds of thousands of people that were charged that. That's what they're for. What UCLA is really trying to do is to shut out and shut down victims' opportunity to go to court, because you only have 90 days to what's called opt out of the class. What that means is if you don't opt out of the class, you're forever stuck in it. And why is that important? Well, if you look at the number of patients of Dr. Heaps and divide that by the amount of the class, $74 million, the average payout is around $11,000. To me, that's despicable. The average payout in the Larry Nassar case was $1.2 million. If you're molested, $11,000, $25,000, $250,000, whatever that number is inadequate to help you deal with what you need dealt with. $250,000 won't even cover your psychological expenses. So why would they do that? They did it because it shuts the door on their potential liability forever.
By opting out of the class action settlement, which you must do by May 6th of 2021 under the terms of the settlement, that allows survivors the option of retaining their own counsel and filing an individual case in the state courts. So far, there have been approximately 275 survivors who have filed state court cases, and those are proceeding in the Los Angeles Superior Court as we speak. We're going to be allowed to take discovery in those cases. We will take many depositions. We will serve as many subpoenas as we need to. We'll get every document we can get our hands on, and we're going to get answers as to how this was allowed to happen. What's really important is not just holding Dr. Heaps accountable, but holding accountable those who enabled him and failed to report him and covered up his abuse. Because unless you replace those people and hold them accountable, the same problem's just going to continue to happen over and over again. The state court cases are going to allow us to get to the bottom of how this was allowed to happen and make change.
You know, lawyers make their living on gray. If issues are not clear, if facts are not clear, if somebody's guilty or not liable, that's where lawyers really make their money. And I don't like gray. There are certain things that are just wrong. Our clients are on the side of the angels, as they used to say. What we do is difficult. What happened to our clients is exponentially more difficult than anything we'll experience. The real heroes are the people we represent, because without their voices, none of this would stop.
The best method of healing for me has been being able to give some meaning to what happened to me. Being able to now meet our clients where I once was, which was struggling, scared, confused, overwhelmed, and being able to say, we've got you now, and we're gonna walk you through this. And you literally see people reclaim their power and take their voices back. And it doesn't matter whether you were abused, 2 years ago or 25 years ago.
I know a lot of the questions a survivor might have, because I have those questions myself before I spoke up. What will my partner think? What will my neighbors think? What will my children think? Speaking up is hard to do, but speaking up is the only way to stop the evil. Speaking up was a way to become free of the shame, to become free of the lies. It brought me freedom.
I used to think all these women are standing behind me and maybe they don't have a voice, and then I realized, no, we're all standing next to each other holding hands. Like, nobody's behind or in front of anybody, and we're all united. And I can feel like I just sometimes close my eyes and imagine holding the hands next to me, and they're holding the other victim's hands, and we're all together, that collective understanding and identifying with each other, but also like it's time for us to have justice.